It was a hot June afternoon in 1999, the kind of heat that makes the highway shimmer and the tall grass lean away from you as if it knows something you don't. A farmer was driving down Route 367 in St. Charles County, Missouri, and he saw it. Something pale in the waist-high grass, out where the road curves and the world feels a little emptier. He slowed, pulled over, walked up, and realized a body, decomposed, alone, no wallet, no phone, no easy answer. In the right pocket of the jeans, 2 folded sheets of paper, soaked at the edges, covered in a dense hand, letters, dashes, numbers, clusters that did not form words anyone could read. Who was he? What did those notes mean? And why, more than 2 decades later, are they still unanswered? Hi, I'm Elena Maris, and this is Still Unanswered. Welcome to the show. We tell stories about lives that end with questions, sometimes tiny, sometimes enormous, and we try to hold those questions with care. No music, just voices. Today, Ricky McCormick, a man found dead in a Missouri field in 1999, and the 2 pieces of paper in his pocket that have since become one of the FBI's most confounding mysteries. With me is Dr. Marcus Hale, a cryptanalyst and historian of codebreaking. Marcus, thanks for coming back.
Thanks, Elena. It's good to be here. This is one of those cases that sits at the intersection of forensics, linguistics, and human tragedy, so it's important to be precise and also to be, humane.
Absolutely. Before we go further, one quick note. We'll be talking about decomposition and death, but there are no graphic descriptions. We'll keep this about the questions, the papers, and the man who wore them. Let's start by putting a name to the body. Who was Ricky McCormick? Ricky Allen McCormick was 41 years old. He lived in St. Louis County. By many accounts, he was a small, hard-living man. He had medical problems, heart trouble, lung issues, and a patchwork of odd jobs over the years. He dropped out of high school, he'd had run-ins with the law, including a conviction that led to children and later complicated relationships with family members. People who remembered him from the neighborhood told reporters that he sometimes carried scraps of paper with scribbles, things he jotted down, little notes, lists, maybe reminders. Some said he struggled to read and write. And then, in late June of 1999, his body was found in that field off Route 367, about 20 miles from where he'd lived in St. Louis. Identification came through fingerprints. Cause of death, though, was recorded as undetermined because of how far along the decomposition was. No gunshot, no obvious stabbing, no car left at the scene, no witnesses who could say for certain who he'd been with in the hours before he died. Just 2 sheets of paper in his pocket.
It bears repeating. The man in this story was a person first. We can get wrapped up in the cipher, but the papers were on somebody's body. That matters.
Right, and the papers are where the story turns strange. The police at first treated them like scrap, odd handwriting, maybe rambling. And then, for reasons we'll get into, the images of those pages went public in 2011. The FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit asked the public for help. They said, if you can read these, you might help identify where Ricky had been and why he'd been there. The response was immediate and intense. Marcus, you were one of the people who took a long look. For listeners who haven't seen the scans, describe what these pages actually look like.
Okay. Imagine 2 single-sided folded pieces of paper, full of dense uppercase letters arranged in lines. Not quite neat, not quite chaotic. There are clusters of letters that repeat. A cluster like NSE shows up in different places. There are number-like elements, things that look like decimals. 71.95 appears on one line. There are parentheses, short dashes, and a rhythmic quality. Certain letter combinations recur, sometimes with what might be separators between them. But do they map onto English word frequencies? Not in any straightforward way. They don't line up cleanly with a simple substitution cipher where A equals M, B equals Q, and you work your way out. There isn't a clear pattern of the kind we can match to a known language at first glance.
So, for the lay listener, what are the first steps a professional takes when confronted with unknown text like this? You don't just stare and hope for inspiration, right?
No, you start simple. You look at letter frequency. In English, the most common letters are E, T, A, O. There's a statistical fingerprint. If a text is a substitution cipher of English, even if letters are replaced, the frequency distribution often looks similar. We also search for repeated patterns, cribs, words or letter groups we can confidently identify. We map out structure. Are there separators that could be spaces? Are punctuation marks used consistently? And we look for numbers. If there are real decimals or numbers, they anchor the rest of the text. For the McCormick papers, those normal first tests didn't point to a conventional encryption method. The frequencies don't match English, and the structure resists the usual tools.
Right. So it configures as not a standard cipher, but that still leaves a lot of possibilities. Before we explore theories, because listeners will want that, let's reconstruct Ricky's last days as best we can. What do we know about where he had been in the days before the body was found? There are a few threads. The most concrete is a bus ticket. Ricky had purchased bus travel in the months before his death and was known to ride buses around the St. Louis area. Friends and acquaintances said he sometimes traveled to places like Florida in the past. In the weeks before he was found, he had been seen at a hospital for chest pain, which aligns with his heart trouble. People who knew him described him as social in a rough, limited way. He had acquaintances, sometimes ties to people who sold drugs, according to some reports. But again, none of this is airtight.
We should stress the difference between possibility and proof. There's a lot of hearsay, people connecting dots because the case is alluring. We don't have verified documentation that he was with drug dealers on the day he died, or that any specific person led him to that field. That's where the papers become attractive to investigators. They seem like a potential breadcrumb trail to the last hours of his life.
And yet, when investigators first found the papers, they didn't immediately treat them as the key. For 12 years, almost no one outside a small circle even knew these notes existed. It's only when the FBI posted them online in 2011 that the world started to look. Marcus, why would the FBI make that choice? It's unusual for law enforcement to release a cryptic piece of evidence like this, right?
It is unusual, but not unheard of. The Bureau's Cryptanalysis unit clearly believed that the notes might contain something actionable. A place name, a name of a person, a ledger that would place Ricky somewhere. When internal efforts and standard cryptanalysis didn't crack it, they opted to crowdsource. Posting it is an admission that, without context, it's a hard problem. There might be someone out there who recognizes the handwriting, the shorthand, or a fragment of the system. It also opens the possibility that the notes aren't a formal cipher at all, and someone with local knowledge could make sense of them. Still, it is a gamble, because once an image is public, the conversation takes on a life of its own. Armchair detectives, pattern finders, conspiracy circle.
And it did. Within hours, images of the pages were being shared, annotated, debated. The internet can be brilliant at finding obscure knowledge, but it can also amplify feelings, hope, obsession, outrage. That brings us to a critical tension in this story: the notes as a code worth breaking, and the notes as private markings that mean something only to their author. Let's look at some of the most prominent theories. Marcus, the first one listeners expect, is drug-related ledger or code. Lay it out. What makes that plausible, and what undercuts it?
Plausible. The lines, at a glance, resemble ledgers, clusters that could be initials, numbers that could be prices or weights. The remote location where his body was found, and some reports of his association with people involved in low-level drug activity, feed into that narrative. It's not uncommon for street dealers to use shorthand to track transactions, so that reading fits a known pattern. What undercuts it? No one has been able to map a consistent ledger system onto these pages. The numbers don't consistently translate into dollar amounts, and the repetition patterns don't line up with straightforward lists of names or addresses. Also, and this is important, the presence of a ledger doesn't necessitate a violent end. People carry lists. The leap from ledger to murder is attractive, but not automatic.
Listeners often imagine a neat breakthrough. Someone says, oh, that's 71.95 means 71.95, and NSE means North Side East. And suddenly, the case unspools. But real ciphers aren't cinematic like that, are they?
Rarely. Most real-world systems are messy. If this were a true formal cipher, we'd expect to find patterns that match known techniques, repeated substitutions, plausible word breaks, a crib to anchor the rest. If it's not a formal cipher and instead a ledger or a shorthand system, then it's contextual. You need to know the businesses, the local slang, the nicknames. That's why the FBI's decision to go public made sense. They were casting the net wide for contextual knowledge.
Okay, theory 2. The notes are Ricky's private shorthand, meaningful to him, not intended to be decoded by anybody else. That has a different emotional weight. Talk about that.
This is, in many ways, the most humbling possibility for analysts. People invent idiosyncratic systems all the time, especially those with limited literacy or with cognitive differences. They might use letter clusters to stand for whole phrases, they might write phonetically, or they might create symbols that trigger a memory. If Ricky had a personal shorthand, it could make perfect sense to him and be inscrutable to anyone else. The pattern-like qualities, repeats, separators, would be there because his system was consistent internally. But once the key holder is gone, it becomes effectively unsolvable. From a technical perspective, that's the hardest problem because there's no external anchor. From a human perspective, it's also the most tragic. The thing that could answer where he was may have died with him.
You mentioned literacy and coping strategies. That's worth pausing on. Some people, who perhaps can't read fluently, will create systems that look like gibberish to us, but are perfectly logical to them. A string of letters could be a phonetic attempt at a place name, or a shorthand for a mood, or, well, I'll let you continue.
Right. And it's important to note that officials who knew Ricky said he sometimes jotted notes. Family members said he could be inconsistent with reading and writing. That doesn't make him less intelligent. It just means his tools for recording and communicating might have been personalized. We should also remember that people in precarious lives, without stable support, develop creative methods to organize themselves. Those methods aren't always shareable.
The third major theory I'll bring up is harsher. The notes as an expression of mental illness, disorganized thinking, or private fantasy rather than encoding external data. This can feel stigmatizing, so I'm going to ask you to approach it carefully, Marcus.
Absolutely. We need to be careful and compassionate. Some texts we've seen in psychiatric contexts look superficially structured. repeated forms, invented words, but they don't map to external reference in a consistent way. If Ricky suffered from a psychiatric disorder, some people have suggested paranoia or disorganization, his notes might be internal speech made external. That doesn't make them nonsense. It makes them an artifact of someone trying to communicate with themselves. For investigators, that possibility is less useful in solving a death because it doesn't point to a location or a person. But for us listening, it invites empathy. Perhaps the papers are a record of an inner life, not a trail to a murderer.
Listeners, I want to emphasize, none of these scenarios are mutually exclusive. The notes could be partly ledger, partly shorthand, partly private language. Or they could be an elaborate code. Or they could be nothing but, well, noise to outsiders. That's what keeps this case alive. It resists closure. Let's take a closer look at the pages themselves. Marcus, you described repeated clusters like NSE. How do you treat repeated triplets like that? Could they be abbreviations, directions, a name? What's the analyst's internal monologue when they see the same 3 letters show up again and again?
We ask, is this a functional unit? In English, 3-letter combinations that repeat could be short words, the, and, or they could be abbreviations, like NYC or IRS. If it's an abbreviation, we try to connect it to plausible real-world reference. NSE could, in theory, be NSE, standing for 4 words, or north-southeast, but that would be unusual. We also check for positional patterns. Does NSE occur mostly at line beginnings or ends? Is it followed by numbers? If so, that suggests a heading or label. In McCormick's case, some clusters recur in positions that make them look like labels, but there's no consistent rule across the document. That ambiguity is crippling for decryption.
So there's structure, but the structure doesn't resolve into meaning easily. That ambiguity is almost more maddening than a clear dead end.
Exactly. Human pattern recognition loves structure. Our brains will fill in meaning, but a professional analyst has to resist that urge and test hypotheses against data. When nothing holds up under testing, you're left with a slate of plausible stories, each plausible, none proven.
Let's talk about the FBI's public framing in 2011. They didn't say, "This will solve the case for sure." They said, "Help us." They suggested that cracking the notes might shed light on where Ricky had been and why. The public reaction included both brilliant insights and, frankly, cruelty. I want to highlight something the family said in response. For years, they weren't told that the FBI believed the death might be suspicious, and they were angry that the notes were online without their input. That felt like a violation.
That's a vital point. There's a human cost to turning a person into a puzzle. Families watch strangers dissect handwriting that belonged to their loved one and feel as if their grief is being turned into entertainment. The FBI's transparency can be defended on investigative grounds. Crowdsourcing can be effective, but it cuts into family trust if they feel excluded. Ethically, there's a balance between solving crimes and respecting the dignity of the deceased and their families.
There's also the risk of romanticizing an ordinary life because it looks mysterious on paper. People want mysteries. We are wired for resolution. But what if the answer, if there ever is one, is smaller than the myth? A grocery list, a dream journal fragment, a shorthand for clinic appointments. Would that undercut the effort? Would it disappoint us?
It might disappoint some, but I think it would also be a reminder, an important one, that human lives are rarely as glorious as a good mystery. They are messy, small, And sometimes the things that seem like puzzle boxes are actually intimate, banal artifacts. That doesn't make them less meaningful. If Ricky's notes turned out to be quiet things, appointments, names of people he loved or resented, that's not lesser. That's a human answer.
I want to talk about methods people used online when the images went public. There were linguists, hobby cryptanalysts, military code breakers, people who looked at letter frequency, attempted substitution rigs, tried pattern matching, even computational brute force attacks. Marcus, from your experience, how often do public crowdsourced efforts crack true dead-letter ciphers?
It depends. Crowdsourcing is powerful when the cipher relies on context-local slang, transcription conventions, or non-secret keys. For instance, a cipher that uses place names or personal nicknames is more likely to be recognized by the right person in a crowd. It's less effective against well-designed, formal ciphers without a crib. Where crowdsourcing falters is exactly the sort of problem McCormick presents, potentially idiosyncratic, possibly private, and lacking an external anchor. People will propose translations, some plausible, some fanciful, but without corroborating evidence, it's hard to accept any one as definitive.
And of course, even plausible-looking decryptions can be wrong. Human pattern seeking makes coincidences look like meaning. I remember one thread where someone insisted that certain clusters were local bar nicknames. It was compelling to that person's community, but unprovable. The internet can supply conviction without the standards of proof we expect in court or in forensic work.
Exactly. The standards for an academic or legal claim are high. You need reproducible methodology, corroboration, and ideally an independent anchor, a witness or another document. A compelling fit online is not the same as a verified translation.
Listeners who love true crime want to know, is there any chance these notes will be solved in the future? New techniques, new databases, an eyewitness suddenly remembering a nickname? Any of that plausible?
There's always a chance. Advances in computational linguistics can find subtle statistical relationships humans miss. New witnesses age into memory and sometimes surface. A relative might find a shopping list that uses the same shorthand. But it's important to temper hope with realism. If the notes are a private system peculiar to Ricky, without external mirrors, there's no guarantee they'll ever be decoded. If they are a ledger with city-specific abbreviations, someone could eventually recognize them. There's a gradient of possibility. The worst-case scenario, where the meaning died with Ricky, is painful but possible.
Let's step back and ask, why are we, and so many others, held by this particular mystery? There are plenty of unsolved deaths. Why do these pages hold our attention? Part of it is the allure of the code itself. Humans love puzzles, Voynich manuscripts, zodiac ciphers, encrypted letters. There's a romance to the idea that a hidden message can summon order from chaos. But beyond that, there is vulnerability. A man with health problems found alone, unidentified for a time, with something in his pocket that might be his last communication. That combination, finality plus a visible secret, pulls at us. We want to rescue a meaning for him. We want to fold his life into a tidy narrative.
And on top of that, there's the justice angle. People hope that the notes contain evidence that will point to injustice. Someone who harmed him, something that explains foul play. That desire is entirely reasonable, but it can also bias interpretation. We have to be careful not to let hope masquerade as evidence.
You mentioned other famous unsolved codes, Voynich, Zodiac, as cultural cousins. There's also the phenomenon where a single artifact turns a person into an icon. Ricky's family has felt that. They watched strangers argue about his handwriting while their questions about his death remained unanswered. How do we reconcile public fascination with respect for private grief?
One measure is consent and communication. When authorities share evidence widely, they should try to include family and prepare them for the public swirl. Media, in turn, should treat family perspectives as central, not peripheral. And as consumers of mysteries, we can practice humility, recognizing that a puzzle is also someone's story, and that solving it doesn't entitle us to treat the person as a curiosity.
Listeners, if you take one thing from this episode, I hope it's that nuance. Not every mystery resolves. Sometimes our attempts to resolve them reveal more about us than about the facts. That said, let's return to the more technical. Are there specific patterns in the notes that have drawn repeated attention, things people latch onto as possible keys?
Yes. Repeating clusters, the decimal-like numbers, and the occasional parentheses. One striking element is the number 71.95. People have speculated wildly about its meaning. Is it a price? A coordinate fragment? A measurement? Also, the recurrence of certain three-letter clusters. Those invite speculation. They might be initials or place name fragments. But again, speculating is not solving. Those features are hooks. They make for great hypotheses, and some are worth checking in the field, but none so far have held up to rigorous cross-checking.
You used the term crib earlier. For listeners unfamiliar, a crib is a known or suspected piece of plaintext that you can match to the ciphertext to help decode a larger system. Are there any credible cribs in this case?
No credible ones have emerged. If we had, say, one clear place name we could anchor to, we could start mapping substitutions. Without that, we can try to model it statistically against different languages or test for common ciphers, but those methods have been inconclusive. That's part of why the FBI called for outside help. The hope that someone would recognize the pattern as a known slang or shorthand.
I want to pause for a moment and listen. Marcus, do you ever sit with these pages and feel, what? Frustration? Curiosity? Something else?
All of the above. There's clinical curiosity, how to approach a hard problem. And there's human frustration, because I keep returning to the fact that a person's final possessions are being analyzed like a test case. But there's also respect. Handwritten artifacts carry personality. The stroke of a pen, the spacing, the hesitation marks, those are traces of someone alive once. That humility shapes how I approach such material.
That's a good reminder. The notes are not artifacts in a lab. They were in Ricky's pocket. They've been photographed and disseminated, but they were made in a life. Let's run through the strengths and weaknesses of the three main theories quickly, because listeners often want a tidy comparison. Theory 1. Drug-related ledger or murder motive. Strengths: possible matching patterns to transaction logs, remote location, some contextual rumors. Weaknesses: no consistent mapping of numbers to transactions, no direct evidence connecting the notes to any known deal. Theory 2. Private shorthand. Strengths: consistent with reports about Ricky's note-taking, explains idiosyncratic repetition, possible if Ricky had invented his own system. Weaknesses: effectively unsolvable without the keyholder or a related artifact. Theory 3. Mental health-related or internal notes. Strengths: explains apparent structure without external reference, aligns with known examples of disorganized personal writing. Weaknesses: risks pathologizing and, again, doesn't help investigators find leads.
And to add, these categories can overlap. A note can be both shorthand and a ledger. Human expression is rarely monolithic.
We are now approaching the last part of the episode. Before we close, I want to reflect on the ethical dimension again. Cases like this encourage deep, often obsessive scrutiny. People pour hours into trying to decipher. That energy can be a force for good, finding witnesses, generating tips, but it can also distract from more mundane but important tasks, checking records, re-interviewing acquaintances, re-examining the body with new forensics. The spectacle of the code can become a siren.
That's a good point. The novelty of a cipher can overshadow basic investigative work. Digital sleuthing should complement, not replace, traditional methods. And critically, we must remember the family, keeping them informed, treating them with dignity. I've talked with investigators on cold cases where, after years of public attention, families felt re-traumatized instead of helped. There are ways to involve the public that prioritize people, not puzzles.
Marcus, before we go, one last technical question. If you had unlimited time and resources, what would you do next with those 2 pages?
I'd start with exhaustive contextual work. That means re-examining Ricky's known associates, places he frequented, records of transactions around his life, pay stubs, clinic appointments, bus routes, local business ledgers. On the technical side, I'd run the pages through multiple statistical models, n-gram analysis across languages, hidden Markov models to find latent patterns, comparative analysis with any other handwriting known to be Ricky's. I'd also search for any other documents from his life that show similar markings. The single most useful breakthrough would be finding a contemporary note, something written by Ricky that uses the same system but with an explicit label or name. Without that, you're largely in the dark.
So the answer is both high-tech and low-tech, computers and context. That feels fitting for a case that sits between human life and cryptographic curiosity. Marcus, thank you. This has been clear, careful work.
Thank you, Elena. And thanks to your listeners for holding the balance between fascination and respect.
Before we close, 2 quick things. 1, if anyone listening here tonight remembers Ricky, knew him, or recognizes the style of those notes in a way the public hasn't, please contact law enforcement. The FBI put the images out because they wanted help. The second, to Ricky's family, if you're listening, this episode is not meant to turn your loved one into a riddle. It's meant to honor that there remains a story without an ending. We are holding that unfinished thing with humility. I want to end quietly with a short reflection. Imagine a man folding 2 sheets of paper and slipping them into his pocket. Imagine his hand, the creases, the little moments before his life tipped into the unknown. We may never know what those letters meant. They might be a map, a ledger, a private language, or the scattered fragments of a lonely mind. They might have meant nothing to anyone but Ricky. They might someday give up a name, a place, a reason. For now, they sit folded in an image on a server, and a world of strangers has tried to conjure a meaning for him. The papers in Ricky McCormick's pocket may one day give up their secret. For now, they remain what so many of our deepest questions are, still unanswered. This episode of Still Unanswered was written and produced by me, Elena Maris. Research assistance by a long list of patient people. Our guest was Dr. Marcus Hale. If you have questions, suggestions, or memories of Ricky you'd like us to consider for future episodes, email us. Details on the website. Please consider this. If you're drawn to puzzles, hold gently the people on whose pages they were written. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.